Thank you, Gary. It's wonderful to be here, touching grass with all of you in real life. Chair's prerogative. I think one of the biggest dangers of the next 2 days is I suspect that this room agrees on a whole lot more than they disagree. I would bet there's a lot of sympathy for Gary's Thomas Kuhn-inspired framework of political orders, the kind of conceit of what this project is. And I bet there's even more consensus that we're all rooting for the good movie version in this new contest of ideas to win out. And further, that there's a fair bit of emerging consensus as to the guts, the substance of what that good movie version entails. So, to keep things interesting, I will be ruthless not only on timekeeping for this first panel, but on really pushing this esteemed company to sharpen both pieces of unfinished business, like what the most important questions are, in this case, within the container of industrial policy, and really where there's productive tension among the kind of broad disagreement I suspect we have here. So I think it's fitting that we are starting, as we roll up sleeves, with one of the surest indications that we were living in 4 decades of neoliberalism, and now one of the surest indications that order is gone and we are building something new, and that is, of course, industrial policy. What better sphere to study when you think about the way in which the state might dare to set ambitions beyond the normal workings of the market, and shape markets in service of those ambitions. There's hardly anything more post-neoliberal. Working title. We're still working on a better term than that. Open target for anybody who has ideas. So I'm within this Rubicon of industrial policy. I'm so pleased to introduce our lineup here. I think we'll start first with Diane Coyle, who is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy here at Cambridge, where she focuses on productivity, growth, and the all-important question of how you should measure those things. She also advises the UK government on questions of industrial policy and economics more broadly. And so we'll ask you, Diane, to kind of lay out a little bit of the theoretical underpinnings, so far as we know them, of this new form of industrial policy, so far as it has reemerged. Next, we will move to Noam Maggor, am I pronouncing it? Maggor, who is the senior lecturer in American history at Queen Mary University of London, where his work focuses on the political and institutional foundations of the American economy. He co-convenes the U.S. Political Economy Lab and serves on the editorial board of Past and Present. Noam, we are going to turn to really historicize both the theory and practice of industrial policy, and hopefully getting into some of the deeper reasons for the antibodies to industrial policy that we see kick up within neoliberalism, and to some degree the reactionary tide of neoliberalism. Now we've poked the bear, I don't know if you've noticed, at least in the US, and the bear's talking back. So if you could kind of help us make sense of some of those more recent antibodies we're seeing to industrial policy. Following Noam, we'll move to Todd Tucker. He's the director of industrial policy and trade at the Roosevelt Institute, where he really thinks about the political economy of economic transformation. He is a homecoming of sorts for Todd. He has a PhD from the old Cambridge here. I think Todd's going to give us some color on the various twists and turns that industrial policy has taken over the decades. As we know, it never fully left the scene. It just became less fashionable and less coherent, perhaps, during neoliberalism's reign. And I think he'll probably end on some reflections of the attempts that we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years in the US to revive industrial policy. Should note, right, that these attempts are bipartisan. And I think you will continue seeing versions of it. It was Marco Rubio, as well as places like the IMF during the first Trump administration, that were urging a return to industrial policy, as much as it was some of those who are a bit left of center. We will have Carsten Jung bring us home. Carsten is the Associate Director for Economic Policy and AI at IPPR, where he leads the economy team. Carsten, I think, will give us a view on how some of these experiments are getting called in the UK as well as the EU. So with that, Diane, over to you.
Thank you so much. What a great crowd. Wonderful to see everybody, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I thought I'd start with what is industrial policy. I should say I'm a member of the UK government's Industrial Strategy Advisory Council. I need to get used to saying I'm not speaking for the council, and of course the fact that we give the government advice doesn't mean they take it. But so what do we understand by industrial policy? I always think of it as intentional government attempts to improve the supply side of the economy, to determine what is going to be produced, what value is added, what jobs are created. And economists divide industrial policy instruments into two kinds. The horizontal kinds that apply to all a range of different companies across the economy. And that would be things like general skills investment, tax credits that don't depend on the sector that you're working in, investment in infrastructure, and so on. Economists like these for reasons I'll explain later. And then the other kind is vertical, which are applied to particular sectors. And so countries would typically pick sectors that their economy is deemed to be strong in. So for us, it's the creative industries, professional services, including finance, some parts of advanced manufacturing, and so on. Among economists and among politicians on the right, for sure, industrial policy was out of favour rhetorically for a long time, since at least Thatcher and Reagan. And here, Mrs. Thatcher downgraded and eventually abolished what we used to call NEDI, the National Economic Development Organization, which was the place where tripartite discussions took place to shape these supply-side outcomes. And to some extent, it was right that industrial policy got a bad reputation, because in the 1970s, a lot of it went very badly wrong. It wasn't just vertical. It focused, in fact, on specific companies. And in our case, it was failing companies like British Leyland, lame ducks that couldn't stand on their own webbed feet, so they got government subsidies, and then they still failed anyway. And that created the political opportunity for a different set of ideas about how governments should relate to the economy to come in. But of course, it's not that industrial policy ever stopped. And sometimes it was intentional. People often point to DARPA in the US as an example of a broadly sector-focused industrial policy that succeeded tremendously in inspiring innovation, creating large, successful companies that exported a lot. There are countries that have a much stronger tradition of planning, like the Netherlands and France, where the idea of industrial policy has never really faded away, nor the sense of the importance of some national champions. There were initiatives like Airbus across Europe, involving 4 European countries, to create successfully a competitor to Boeing and open up that market a little. And then there have been the unintentional industrial policies, the ones that dare not speak their name. And for us, it would be finance, with a lot of investment in infrastructure serving the City of London, deregulation to create a favourable environment, or pharmaceuticals, favoured by specific tax credits and government investment in R&D at a large scale, or in fact the creative industries, where we've got the BBC as the linchpin of the creative sector, providing training, in fact created as an industrial policy back in the 1920s to compete with RCA of America and with engineering in broadcasting at its core. And so even not doing something intentionally means you end up doing something, and so we've always favoured these particular sectors. Now, the policy does once again dare speak its name, And some economists never stop. I want to shout out to Danny, who's here in the room somewhere, and never gave up on it. But counts of industrial policy show a rising number around the world, and particularly in the OECD economies. There's a renewed interest among academic economists in industrial policy, and obviously in political circles as well. So why is this happening? I think history is overdetermined, but to an economist, it looks like technology is one of the key drivers. We have got major transformations in energy technologies and communications technologies with digital and AI. We call these general purpose technologies. They spread eventually throughout the whole economy. And that means that policy choices now in these sectors in particular will shape the capacity of the economies to produce for decades to come. These are quite decisive times. I think I'd add to that the lesson that the US and UK in particular have learned from the whole period of globalization and outsourcing so much manufacturing to economies in East Asia, which is that you lose important engineering capabilities when you ship out the manufacturing. I used to be as globalist as all the rest of my profession until I read an article in 2014 by Gregory Tassi that made this point about the need to retain engineering capabilities locally really effectively. So I think the questions now are, will it succeed? Will it boost growth? Will it create jobs, these new industrial policies? And does it actually mark a break from neoliberal capitalism? And I think there are three obstacles to having optimistic answers to these. One is that it's not clear to me that governments, politicians, and policymakers have actually got a different philosophy about the relationship of the state and the markets. I think to a large extent, those groups of people still see market and state as substitutes for each other, not complements to each other, to put it in economic terms. And I'd certainly say that's true of the Labour government in the UK. Perhaps it's because there's no well-articulated alternative. Second is that we've had 40, 50 years of globalization rewiring production chains, and now we have global production networks in key areas of our economy. This makes it much harder to think about national policies and the interests of what appear to be national companies, but that operate across many countries, and national economic outcomes. That becomes quite tense. And in fact, we're seeing with the Trump administration a deliberate choice, it seems to me, to focus on national production, even at the cost of reducing growth potentially quite substantially, which will not be good for people's jobs and livelihoods. And then finally, there's the power of the multinationals, especially the big American tech companies, who are certainly not aligned with national interests nor with the public good. And what we might end up with, and again, I'm taking a UK perspective on this, is a sort of international corporatist capitalism, which respects the interests of these big companies much more than national industries. But to conclude on a positive note, I think it's better to be intentional than not about your industrial strategies, and at least the revival of industrial policies is rekindling that debate about what capacities do we need in our own territories and for our own people. Thank you. Thank you. No.
Historians write their comments, so I'm going to use my prerogative to do that. And I thought a lot about what it means for me. I'm a historian of the US in the 19th century, what it means for me to be part of this panel and how to weigh in. I'm going to give it my best shot. I'm going to start with a quotation from Ha-Joon Chang and Yuan Ang, who have written, beware the fairy tale retellings of history, especially those authors by economists and political scientists rather than by historians. That seemed like a good opening for me. It's a good welcome note of caution issued by these heterodox scholars. They've both argued that canonical historical accounts coming out of social science, primarily from institutionalist economics, are partial and selective. These narratives are shaped by a highly ideological, yet historically selective and partial understanding about the sources of economic progress. Chief among them are, as people here probably know, secure property rights, competitive markets, and a constrained apolitical state apparatus. Chang and Ang urge us to pay more attention to the rich experience of the real world in the present and in history. And I guess this is why I'm here, to provide some historical perspective on industrial policy. I'm writing a book about the history of an agrarian country that became an industrial giant in the span of 2 or 3 decades. The vast majority of people in this society lived on and worked the land. Most exports had always consisted of raw materials and agricultural goods. The country nevertheless emerged as the largest manufacturing economy in the world. Technologically, it had, of course, started out lagging far behind, but it was able to move up the ladder and upgrade its industries. And then it finally broke through with a system of production of unprecedented efficiency that became the envy of the world, maybe even the emblem of modernity as such. I'm talking, of course, about the United States, the quintessential developing nation of the modern age. Before China, over the last 30 years, the United States represented the largest economic leap in world history. And as late as 1870, the late 19th century, the country was overwhelmingly agrarian. 100 years after U.S. independence, almost 90% of American exports consisted of primary commodities, mainly agricultural goods, cotton, and grain. It only made sense given the immense bounty and fertile soil of North America. And like other countries in the New World at the time, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, the US, imported manufactured goods from cheaper and more efficient producers in Europe. By the early 20th century, however, American factories began to flood foreign markets, including European markets, with American products. By then, the US had a larger industrial economy than those of the UK, France, and Germany combined. So how to make sense of this transformation, and what does that teach us about industrial policy? The canonical stories that Chang and Ang and others have criticized, for example, those authored by economists such as Daron Acemoglu and Jim Johnson, Douglas North, Barry Weingast, have been quick to attribute this shift to neoliberal virtues. In these retellings, the US state created the ideal background conditions that successfully unleashed market actors. Their stylized reading of American history have in turn informed the types of policies prescribed to developing nations. Establish good institutions, and prosperity will follow. But of course, this is not how the messy process of economic development happens, and the US was not an exception. It's in fact dangerous to argue otherwise, to assume that American economic development was a straightforward process driven by private forces with little help from government. Historians of the US have unfortunately been just as guilty in perpetuating this myth, but I think it's time to do away with that. And this brings us to industrial policy. Deliberate state policies aim to reshape economic change. There has been, over the last few years, some rediscovery of industrial policy as quite an old idea in American history. It famously goes back to Alexander Hamilton's report on manufactures in the 1790s that called on the American federal government to nurture American industrialization. Or later on, Henry Clay's American system in the 18 teens and 20s that looked to jumpstart national economic growth with a system of turnpikes and canals and other protectionist measures. During the Biden years, policymakers and journalists, I was following that very closely, started to make references to this history, and they were correct. Industrial policy is indeed native to America, not a foreign import. From the beginning, many in the US argued that political independence from the British Empire meant little without economic independence. In other words, industrial policy has always been driven by politics and geopolitics as well as economics. The US was not alone in this respect. Revolutionaries in Latin America and really all anti-colonial movements around the world in the 19th and 20th century always looked to leverage political independence to gain economic autonomy. They've even occasionally pointed to the US as a post-colonial success story. But what commentators in recent years perhaps forgot or didn't know, but did not mention, is that the Hamiltonian project and later Whig development, kind of Clay's development projects, were both electoral busts. The Federalist Party had quite a short career. Clay's developmentalist American system never made it through Congress. He lost 3 presidential elections. Maybe historians should have warned Democrats about this, that industrial policy is often a losing political issue. The notion of top-down national economic planning struggled to gain traction in American politics. The moral condescension of liberal elites didn't help. And thus, the US, early in its history, was often governed by reactionary coalitions of slaveholders, frontier settlers, and working-class voters. These coalitions saw nothing to gain from economic development. They championed free trade, low taxes, and land grabs out west. The American Developmental Coalition came together later on after several decades in the wilderness under Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's Republicans managed to rally Western farmers and other grassroots constituencies. This is how development policy in the US took off. Protective tariffs, which, yes, we've heard a lot about, but also a domestic game, an array of other policies, land, banking, education, anti-monopoly, government, corporate regulation, all geared to channel capital into productive investment. An array of government policies in the late 19th century harnessed private forces in ways that facilitated a massive economic transformation, American industrialization. They embraced a qualitative shift, not merely quantitative linear growth. Unlike earlier efforts, much of the creative impulse and ideas came from the grassroots. In my own work, I show how this worked in the area of American railroads. Railroads were great for shipping raw materials and agricultural commodities over long distances. This is why in most places around the global periphery, in India and Brazil, in Africa, railroads became instruments of economic extraction, colonialism, and underdevelopment. And we can talk later maybe about why lack of government regulation produces scarcity rather than abundance. Western farmers understood these tendencies amazingly well. And unlike peasant populations elsewhere around the world, they wielded a great deal of political power, especially at the state level, and they used it to push back. They refused to become part of a disempowered, extractive periphery or a hyper-specialized commodity frontier. They instead promoted legislation that forced railroads to provide widespread access to transportation, maintain adequate regular service to communities of all sizes, and cross-subsidize costs in ways that made local and regional shipping affordable. Corporations and investors challenged these regulations in the court, including the Supreme Court, but failed most famously with the Munn decision of 1876 that sanctioned regulation of private industries that were, quote, clothed with the public interest. So the decision effectively blurred the difference between private and public. Acemoglu and his many followers would have disapproved. The decision became, as one legal scholar put it, a superhighway for a truckload of far-reaching experiments in the state regulation of new economic activities. I guess that mixes the metaphors a little bit, trucks and railroads, but you get the principle. Regulated transportation nurtured a deep and incredibly diverse process of Midwestern urbanization and industrialization. Prosperous farmers provided a domestic market for dozens of towns and cities. The same towns and cities absorbed the agricultural produce of their farming communities. This trajectory reached a climax in the dramatic rise of the most transformative manufacturing industry of the 20th century, the automobile industry, born in Detroit, Michigan, out of this particularly Midwestern ecosystem. Railroad regulation of the type that I'm describing was essentially a form of industrial policy from below. It did not insulate the market from political meddling. as the institutionalists recommend. Rather, it harnessed railroad transportation to the promotion of what was ultimately a deeply political project. It infringed on rather than protected private property. In the words of development economist Alice Amsden, regulation made sure American railroads got prices wrong. The driving force behind this were not technocrats informed by the best social science, but grassroots constituencies who developed their own heterodox economic ideas and who had the political power to implement them. This tradition of, yes, I'll be done soon enough. This tradition of regulated competition characterized the American approach to strategic industries. This expanded from the states to the federal level, from the populist age to the New Deal, from railroads to utilities to trucking and airlines. Ganesh, who's here, his collaborators have shown that this is, generally speaking, how economic governance worked in the US through to the 1970s. Okay, so to conclude quickly, what are the lessons here? First, as we move beyond neoliberalism, we need to take seriously challenges to our prevailing theories of political economy, especially those that come from what used to be the periphery or the global south. I think they understand the constraints, the challenges, the laws of motion that we are now waking up to. And a lot of what I'm trying to do is do that. Second, by definition, industrial policy is difficult to implement and often fails, and not only because it is difficult to get the technical details right or to win the battles of ideas, it is a hard sell because by definition, it tries to move away from the status quo and therefore bound to arouse the anger and resistance of all those who are invested in existing arrangements, even if they impoverish society as a whole. The main challenge is the political challenge of bringing different constituencies together, elite actors with active grassroots support into a developmental coalition. Not easy, but it has proven to be indispensable in driving large-scale economic transformations of the type that is so sorely needed today. Thank you.
Chair's prerogative. I'd like to put Ganesh on the spot to ask a smarter version of the question, Noam, you prompted for me, which is several of the industries that you mentioned in the same breath as rail all fit a version of a natural monopoly or heavily regulated industry. I think you were kind of sticking to transportation, but several even within that to choose from. What are the characteristics of such natural monopolies that should call us to think about how to do industrial policy there differently? I tasked this to Ganesh because he just wrote a textbook on trying to revive what has been a relatively moribund area of law on thinking about how to regulate such natural monopolies. A lot of fertile sort of rethinking and fertile ground for policy experimentation in areas like utilities that desperately need a kick. Okay, and next we will move to Todd.
All right, thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thanks to Gary and Noam and Hannah for organizing this great conference. Really excited you were able to do this. And I do remember sort of our conversation last year in Paris, plotting out what the second term would look like and how we would improve and globalize some of this industrial policy efforts. We are not in the world that we had hoped we might be in, but I think, as Gary, you mentioned, that makes this kind of gathering all the more important to connect with each other, to reflect, also to learn from the experiences and what went wrong and what went right and what we could be doing differently. It does feel like this really is kind of an interregnum moment, to inject a little bit of breaking news into today. There was a federal court this morning or last night just decided that Trump's trade tariff tantrum does not follow U.S. sort of legal requirements, which is, leading to sort of the interesting spectacle of a lot of a lot of liberals and progressives cheering for free trade again, which just kind of suggests that there is a bit of an unsettled nature to intellectual inquiry and debate these days that I think is worth exactly this type of conference can help us sort of think more strategically about. It's great to be doing this industrial policy panel here at Cambridge. As Noam, you mentioned, Jen, I had the great opportunity to be here on 2 different occasions, once for a master's in the early 2000s, and then again for a PhD about 10 years ago. And, there was a time in the 90s and the 2000s where if you were interested in studying industrial policy, there was very few places in the world to do it. Ha-Joon Chang, the development studies department here, was one of the few places where you could go if you were interested in these questions. And it's great to now see this kind of come full circle and there being a lot more attention from a lot of different mainstream and other circles to these questions of industrial policy. I want to sort of do 2 things in the time that I have here today. One is to sort of outline, especially since it was kind of funny as we were putting together this panel, because I think we had 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 folks fall ill in the last couple of days. So there's clearly some sort of higher power there that's not too happy about our having this conversation about industrial policy. But I think that what I will try to do is just, I think, some of the perspective that Nathan Lane in particular from Oxford would have brought. I'll sort of try to share and channel some of what I think he would have said before then sort of turning to a little bit of a reflection on sort of the structure and the results and outcomes of Bidenomics, or the new industrial policy in the U.S. So to first kind of sort of give a plug, I think that there's 2 articles by folks that are here at this conference that you should really be reading if you want to try to understand the last few decades of debate around industrial policy. One is by Rekha Juhasz, Nathan Lane, and Danny Roderick, who's here, on the new economics of industrial policy, which was just published. Really important overview to sort of the advances both in theory and empirics around industrial policy and some of the promising directions going forward. Also, from a few years ago, The Political Economy of Industrial Policy by Antonio Andreoni and Ha-Joon Chang, that does a little bit of the same, taking an even sort of broader perspective going back to the Hamiltonian era. And especially Chang and Andreoni, they sort of identify a few different phases of the industrial policy debate. One kind of was that sort of Hamiltonian and the 19th century debates that Noam was talking about, sort of a second period around decolonization and the big push sort of theories about that were looking as much as how to sort of develop independent industries that were independent, from the periphery in the Hamiltonian period, but then in the decolonization period, what kinds of industries were complementary to one another, and they really needed to be brought up together if either was going to survive and thrive. Then, of course, we have sort of the East Asian experiments and developmental state debates of the sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, going all the way then towards sort of the more contemporary and sort of mainstreaming of a lot of this conversation over the last 10 or 15 years. And if you look at sort of over those periods, there's a range of different economic justifications for why countries pursued industrial policy. The sort of most obvious and kind of comfortable from a lot of econ thinkers' perspectives is the problem of externalities, and both positive and negative. So in instances where there's this benefit to society is maybe greater than the benefit that any one firm would see from its investments, there is a justification to try to help firms internalize those positive externalities by granting subsidies of the kind that are probably one of the most common industrial policy tools. I think if it were just that would be kind of somewhat boring on a level. Like, if you have a negative externality, you tax it. If you have a positive externality, you subsidize it. That would be, I think, fairly comfortable terrain for a lot of economists. And I think a lot of the conversations, for instance, now around the climate crisis, we would just be talking about a carbon tax, and that would be kind of done, and that would be the end of the conversation. Luckily, both for it being a more interesting intellectual inquiry, but then also just as a matter of what are the things that policymakers need to actually address, the range of market failures, it goes well beyond that. There is extensive, as Diane was saying, there's also extensive coordination problems that need to be addressed. that subsidies on their own, just tax credits on their own aren't going to be able to cut it. There's a wide range of reasons for states to get involved, and I think we saw this sort of recently in the U.S. context of you want more electric vehicles on the market, but then you need the inputs to those electric vehicles to also be coming onto the market. And you also need the people that want to buy the electric vehicles to be interested in buying the electric vehicles. And if any one of those pieces aren't moving, then the system collapses and there really isn't a move forward. You had lithium refiners in North Carolina. They're waiting for the Detroit automakers to actually get their next models of electric vehicles and others online before it made sense to justify big expenses. And I think that sort of start and stop nature of these coordination problems was sort of a constant challenge over the last few years in the United States. Just citing a few of the things from Danny and Nathan's research on sort of the basic trends in industrial policy. This was, a few years ago, this was something that was considered to be primarily a domain of developing countries, middle income countries. We now see that the range of industrial policies that we can track are most heavily being employed in OECD and richer countries. So 75% of the interventions of the last few years have come from developed economies. We're seeing that it's largely no longer about tariffs. I mean, a few years ago, tariffs and trade measures were sort of almost synonymous with industrial policy in certain quarters. Now we see 98% of the measures, by some measures, are not tariffs, are sort of other mechanisms like subsidies, like research and development dollars. And in some economies, this is going up to 1% of GDP that they're spending on various industrial policy measures. So it really is something that's on the rise. We see this in the statistics. We see this in the empirics. It really is kind of a new era. So let me pivot now to kind of just say a little bit more about sort of, I think, why the Biden administration embraced industrial policy and a few of the lessons we can draw from it. I think the big boost, and as Jen noted, this is really there's a bipartisan lineage to the shift to industrial policy in the US. And it really, I would sort of say a key date is 2015. Which is, for many in the room, you'll know that was when the Made in China 2025 initiative was announced that sort of set numerical targets for market dominance in a range of different sectors. And this came after sort of decades where the prevailing wisdom in Washington and on both sides of the aisle was that if we just sort of pleaded and litigated enough with China at the World Trade Organization, that we would see sort of a change in behavior. And I think what Made in China 2025 showed is that certainly in spirit, if not the letter, that was not working. And so a different strategy was needed that was more sort of developing government activism and a strategy of our own, rather than just hoping that China would pursue a different path. Also, that in that year, was when the European Union and Commission sort of commits to using the European Investment Bank and other sort of financial entities, both within member states and across member states, to push for reindustrialization here, on the continent and in the UK. And so that really presented a choice to U.S. policymakers. What are we going to do? Are we going to sort of attempt to learn from this and join this, or just kind of wait while sort of our country continues to deindustrialize? And so you saw from Marco Rubio a really important report in 2017, 2018 that cites many of the people in this room, interestingly, Matsukato, Chang, Roderick, a lot of folks, but drawing that, whether one cares about the climate crisis or not, if you care about national competitiveness, you need to be thinking about industrial policy. And then also folks in the room that worked with Elizabeth Warren, sort of similar proposals at the time, singing from a lot of the same hymnal. And, over the course of our very, very long federal elections in the US that last way too long, that have already started now for 2028, this kind of marinated and started bubbling up into what became the Biden administration's and Biden campaign's agenda, what sometimes is called Bidenomics, which is essentially public investment to drive decarbonization, anti-monopoly policy, to drive competition, and worker empowerment to sort of address inequality and some of those interconnected crises. And I think that there is again sort of there is sort of that intellectual history in the U.S. that took us to that moment, but I think it was also the environmental movement, realizing that after decades of sort of arguing for regulation and carbon pricing as the way that we were going to do decarbonization, that there was constraints in the U.S. that whether you liked industrial policy or not, kind of left it as the only game in town. You weren't going to, if you weren't able to do carbon pricing because of the politics, and you weren't able to do regulation because of the Supreme Court, that leaves you as a reluctant practitioner of industrial policy, or some that were enthusiastic, but I think in some cases it was a little bit more reluctant. And so, I think that what we saw with the policy instruments that were innovated over the last few years in the U.S. is that there was a lot of tried and true elements of U.S. policy, like tax credits, that had been used before, but there was a new structure to those tax credits. It was a more kind of developmentalist structure on the back of something that Suzanne Mettler and others have called the submerged state, which is tax credits. We want to do them because no one will know that we're doing them. It's quite quiet. It's behind the scenes. Hopefully voters won't punish us for doing it. There was an attempt to unsubmerge the state with some of these policy instruments makes tax credits more generous if you were paying prevailing wages, if you were working with communities, if you were building domestic supply chains. And so for the investment tax credit, that was a key part of the Inflation Reduction Act, you could have as low as 6% of your capital cost covered if you were just, say, investing in a clean energy technology, but it could go all the way up to 70% if you were investing in former fossil fuel communities and low-income communities. And as a result, we've seen the vast majority of these investments go into communities that had been hard hit by the China shock or that had been previously reliant on oil and gas production. I think that the record of that is impressive and sort of underappreciated. 900 factories across the U.S. that were either new or renovated to produce clean energy products. 6 quarters of record-breaking manufacturing construction across the country. And for the first time in U.S. history, the unionization rate in the clean energy industry actually exceeded that of the fossil fuel industry. So we were really, at both a qualitative and quantitative level, shifting the structure of the U.S. economy. I think that strategy, this is kind of maybe in the learnings part of the conversation. That strategy was optimized for a world where Congress mattered, which is to say that there was a lot of the overwhelming majority of the investments went into Republican states and Republican districts. The political theory of that was that even if the Republican Party doesn't agree, and that's my cue to wrap up. Even if the Republican Party doesn't agree about the climate crisis and the science behind it, they might be compelled by jobs and economic development dollars. And I think that we saw, in some instances, that was true. There was not a majority in Congress on a straight up or down vote on repealing the Inflation Reduction Act. Unfortunately, over the last few months, we've learned that Congress doesn't always matter if you have an executive branch willing to go around it. And so, from the gate, what the administration did was target the very civil servants that are responsible for administering the funds to get out the door, threatening them with criminal prosecution if they just did something as simple as approve an already approved grant application. And what that's done is sort of freeze a lot of nodes of this system, everything from the civil servants administering the plans to the co-financiers of the projects across the country that now are all of a sudden very worried that the project might not go forward. So even if we resolve this case in the courts to the favor of the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and other industrial policies, which I think we will, and I think that sort of in the courts we're likely to prevail, and just as we were this morning on the tariffs. By that point, it may be too late. A lot of these projects, developers will have moved on, communities will have given up, and so I think that is, that shows that kind of demobilization and demoralization can be quite effective. And so I think that this is going to push us in some new directions over the next few years in the U.S. You see a lot of different intellectual movements, whether that's the abundance movement and conversation, or some of the importation from over here in the EU of some of the big green state conversations that have been percolating over here. and the sort of the mission economy ideas that that folks like Matsukato have been writing about, that now you also have folks like New Consensus in the US that are also embracing this idea of missions. So I think over the next few years, industrial policy conversation is not going away. We are going to continue to debate this, and I think that we're going to see a next generation of policy development that that goes probably even further beyond the idea of sort of the simple kind of hands-off tax credit. So we can maybe in the Q&A we can get into some specifics, but with that I'll pass the credit.
Just before you do, Todd. You mentioned some of the impressive stats that Biden's industrial policy attempts had to show for itself at the end of its 4 years. I'd love, Diane, for you to take that and fill it in for us. So, think a little bit, I think with more specificity than we were able to get to in your opening remarks on like what the criteria, how we should be measuring industrial policy. It can be thought of like a new dashboard of metrics. What should it include? I don't ask that hypothetically. Hewlett has funded a dashboard of industrial policy metrics to avoid the kind of cherry-picked debate problem that we've seen, at least in the US context. So before the clay dries on that, if we could get some free advice on what the different criteria and metrics it should include would be. But sorry, Carsten, bring us home.
Great. Thanks very much for having me. Just quickly on IPPR, for those of you who don't know us, we are, I think, the biggest progressive think tank in the UK. We're nonpartisan, and we have for about at least 5 years been pushing for industrial policy in the UK, with a particular focus on green industrial policy, but also more broadly. And I think it was really once the IRA was implemented, and especially when sort of early news came out that it was sort of bearing fruit, that the UK parties, and especially the Labour Party, became really interested in it. And to some extent, Labour ran with ours and other recommendations on industrial policy. And what I'm gonna do now in my introductory remarks is, I think, give a bit of an overview of where we are in the UK with industrial policy, and also where we are in the EU. And I'm not just going to rattle through it, but I thought, given the name of the conference, start with a bit of a framework on how I think the different policies slot into, whether they are sort of in the old paradigm versus if they're sort of a new paradigm. And so let me start with that. So what is actually post-neoliberal about industrial policies? Because as Diane was saying at the beginning, we've had some kind of industrial policy that is basically trying to intervene in the supply side, expand the supply side in some way, change the supply side in some way. We've had that for a long time. If you look at Germany and France, France has a lot of state ownership of big corporations like EDF. The German state is majority stakeholder in Volkswagen, and you had big policies around national champions and technology promotion. For a long time, it never really stopped, as people on the panel were saying. So what's actually different? What was sort of different about the Biden moment, and what's different also in the way the UK government thinks about industrial policy from a sort of more neoliberal past? And in short, I think there's sort of three different buckets in which this is different. And I'm curious if people on the panel think or where they disagree. So one is really that some industrial policies look at new objectives. So whereas in the past, a lot of them was just, well, we're going to support a sector. New industrial policies have higher level objectives. And I think that on the top end of that, you have Matsukato style missions where you have societal goals. So it's not just let's promote a sector or even individual companies, but let's achieve certain societal goals that might involve more than one sector. And that then also involves having more specific targets that reflect those goals. And that, by the way, it is also builds a new kind of politics around it, because politicians make a pledge to citizens around the societal goals rather than just talking in technical terms about sector productivity. Now, with these new goals, if you have a mission, for instance, Ed Miliband's decarbonizing the power grid by 2030, you need you have new objects of analysis. You don't just look at a slice of the economy at one sector, but you look at systems. And as an economist by training, you don't really learn about systems in economics, so this requires a whole new toolbox, both by policymakers but also by economists. New analyses of processes, new analyses of supply chains. Like if you think of what the International Energy Agency does, which I think is actually at the forefront of this new thinking, very deep global supply chain thinking and looking at how all the different parts interact. Again, it's a paradigm shift from economics where you have a representative firm and a representative household. Instead, you map the entire supply chain. And then finally, and again, all this flows from having these new overarching targets. The final bucket is you have new types of policies, which is that you don't just do one single surgically targeted economic intervention, but again, you need to think systemically about how does the supply side interact with the demand side, how do different sectors interact, and you basically need to push all levers at the same time. I think the Biden administration has called this an all-government approach to delivering policy. So you have to break down at the silos. So if all of these are in place, I would argue that is the most post-neoliberal type of industrial policy. And to the extent that they're not in place, we're still slightly more in the old paradigm. So let me go through a couple of examples and sort of categorize them in this scheme. So first of all, the sort of least post-neoliberal type of policies are basically your standard technology policies. For instance, governments have successfully promoted certain technologies, for instance, electric vehicle tax credits or electric vehicle subsidies for people that buy electric vehicles. It's just cheaper. So you have really surgically targeted policy that doesn't necessarily involve the sort of cross-sectoral coordination. Other sort of more targeted policies might be you might want to boost the heat pump industry in your country, so you subsidize heat pumps. You might also, to some extent, subsidize an industry, but there's not necessarily a higher level goal. These are all basically targeted at boosting specific sectors. There's not necessarily a high level target that you're trying to deliver. And again, we've had these for a long time. And the third one in that, and this is very live in the UK, it's also very live in Germany and the EU, is saving specific industries. So the German economy minister today was arguing that Germany needs to save its steel industry because it has, it's an important strategic industry that you need in order to be competitive and in order to have supply chain resiliency. All of these are really important industrial policies. I'm not sort of trying to say that these are not good or not important and we can get into the pitfalls. But in a way that we've seen versions of these before. And so the second category, which I'd argue is slightly more post-neoliberal because it has these sort of higher level targets that make more of a political commitment to the population. And I think a really interesting one is electricity prices. Again, a really live policy debate in the UK and in Germany and in the EU more widely is that these countries are less and less competitive because electricity is so expensive. So that's a problem for heavy industry like steel, but it's also a problem for decarbonization because it just doesn't it's not efficient enough for households to switch to heat pumps. And thirdly, it's also important for economic growth. So countries are actively deliberating how can we lower electricity prices. And so this is interesting because there's no surgical policy that brings electricity prices down. And what countries are proposing is, well, let's take taxes off, but also the grid component of electricity prices, whacks quite a bit of costs on top of it. So we need to sort of deal with the electricity grid and how we funded expansion while not to push too much costs onto consumers. And then thirdly, there is also the build out of renewables that requires upfront costs, but will over time lower the prices. So here you see the objective and the easy commitment of we are going to lower electricity prices has much more systemic questions attached to it and much more sort of complex analysis and policy delivery attached to it. So I think this is a really interesting case, and it will be interesting to see where the UK government comes out on this. And there have been murmurs that they're definitely going to move on electricity prices. And similarly in Europe, there's definitely going to, something is going to happen there. So that's the second category. And then the third category is really the sort of higher level missions, the higher level commitments to the population on what government wants to deliver through industrial strategy. And so there was sort of post-IRA, there was sort of a big focus on green targets, right? So the European Green Industrial Deal, IRA, to some extent linked to high-level climate targets. And they had their heyday, and also the UK government, less so now, and we're probably going to get into that, but at least prior to the election was going really big on sort of its green targets. And those green objectives of industrial policy have now interestingly given way to slightly different objectives of industrial strategy. So the most important probably in Europe and the UK at the moment is interest in defense industrial policy. So Germany has basically revoked its fiscal rule to invest in the defense sector. There's a question on whether they will make all their defense spending sort of have domestic sourcing requirements. So that's a live debate. But people have already termed this war Keynesianism or defense Keynesianism, because it's basically borrowing to invest in the war machinery. And very few specifics are sort of in the open yet. I think there's still a live debate on how this could look like. But there's already people coming out saying a lot of the things that people said about green industrial policy, namely, these can be good jobs, this can be good for growth, it can be domestically sourced. And, for really terrible reasons, but probably defense industrial strategy is here to stay and will get there will be a lot of demand for it and a lot of funding for it. A second one to mention, and then I'll draw it to a close, is something that I work quite a bit on is artificial intelligence and tech policy. So this is quite a new area where, again, a lot of government, both in the UK and Europe, government interest is in building sovereign AI, or building, in Europe it's often called the Euro stack, and sovereign digital sovereignty. And again, there is a sort of abstract commitment to the population to say, we will be the captains of our own digital fate. We will be able to control our own AI. We will not outsource this to the US. And there is sort of a binary, we've either achieved this or we've not achieved this. But in order to honor that commitment, a lot of sectors are involved. And again, a lot of scrambling on how to actually make that work. So you need the digital infrastructure, compute, data centers. You need AI corporations that develop the AI that need to meet certain standards set by the jurisdictions. And then you need to plug that into industry to make sure your industry uses your sovereign AI. So actually a hugely complex industrial strategy undertaking if governments are serious about it, and there is some money behind this. So that's another really interesting new industrial strategy area, which is very non-traditional, very much not a sort of market-driven approach to delivering this. A lot more to say on the specifics of these policies, But I'll stop here. And basically, the takeaway message is we're well beyond the neoliberal turn in industrial policy. I feel like a lot of policy tools that were even 5 years ago out of the question. In a lot of these examples, like sovereign AI, state ownership of data centers, nationality requirements, sourcing requirements, having abstract goals of what you want to achieve, and then developing systemic policy to deliver on this. All of this, with my sense, having been in policy in the UK policy for more than 10 years, is this is really new and it's here to stay, and there's a lot of opportunity.
Thank you, Carsten. And my homework to you, Carsten, or to the room broadly, prompted by your three very good sort of categories. I was ready for you to add a fourth, or make one of your three a more granular taxonomy of some of those tools. In the U.S., it's often now going by the term market shaping. A lot of that was imported originally from the public health space. I'm thinking about things like contracts for differences, which are much more old hat in the UK than in the US. Reverse auctions, double blind auctions, price insurance in the case of some of these upstream supply chain, frailties. Thinking one very brief story: when I was in the White House, I spent the last 3 or 4 months, as Heather can recall, obsessed with critical minerals because everyone had it, therefore no one had it. In some diligence, became very clear that the kind of initial kind of large miners weren't moving, in part not just from PTSD from the commodity downturns of the mid 2010s, but a concern that China would do what it always does and figure out some way of mucking with the market, such that they're kind of going to flood markets below cost of production, even though China itself is a net importer, as you know, of a lot of these raw critical minerals. So the obvious solution seemed to be some form of price insurance. Lots of ways to skin that cat as a matter of policy design. When I went to friends in either the DFC or the Office of Management and Budget, they it was some version of, we'd love to help, really would, but gosh, we just can't figure out how to price something like that. We have robots on Mars. You can figure this out. It is your job. Thus, a long wind up for the question of how does some of these, I will call them more innovative, sort of second generation tools of market shaping tools of industrial policy, run up against the kind of stubborn tissue of the executive branch. I think in all of our countries, my guess is that actually this is something where the US could learn a little bit from the UK in particular, something that the EU is serious about it. It's going to have to confront the considerable layers of bureaucracy in Brussels. So with that, let's open it up to questions, comments, right here. And I'm supposed to ask you to wait, and I think there are mics that are going to come.
Microphone is coming. Wait for the microphone to rise. It's coming.
And please introduce yourself with your question or comment.
Hi. Thanks to all the panelists. I think to your last point, it was when you referenced obliquely defense without maybe just using the term of military Keynesianism, which I guess was deliberate, but I think one of the issues with, if you look at both the Pentagon or you look in sort of central banking, the issue comes down to mandate. And the difference with a military budget is that basically you have an unconstrained mandate where the issues around the functional fiscal policy is to what extent central banking can do this, central banking can do that, and that's probably one of the reasons why I guess the use of defense isn't really going to go away, just simply because it doesn't operate with those constraints. And to actually, to really make, I think, because I don't think we're post, but to kind of really make it post is to make more of a civic case for actually having a similarly unconstrained mandate.
Sorry, tell us who you are.
Sorry?
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Say that one. Oh, myself. Okay, sorry. My name is Neil Anderson. And I guess I was introduced to INET with Bill Janeway maybe like 15 years ago or so. I was in Toronto, I think, when what was interesting about that, I think it was 2014, was that we had people like Bill presenting in at INET, but then literally across the road was a major Bitcoin conference. And I kind of felt like the juxtaposition was actually going to become awkward. And so what we kind of see now is probably
instead it becomes reality. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we see now is like, an indication of that. But I think since then I kind of moved out of tech into more impact investing.
Great. So let's take a couple of more. I see a fair bit of hands, so we'll take a few interventions, starting with Damon, and then come over here before coming back.
Hi, I'm Damon Silvers. I'm a visiting professor at UCL, and I was for a long time the policy director of the AFL-CIO, the American Trade Union Movement. I continue to advise them. I wanted to ask the panel about political economy. And I wanted to, I'll just say my own introduction to that in regard to these issues was in the effort to try to persuade Joe Manchin to vote for the IRA in its original form. And it was very apparent in that effort that the collapse of trade union strength in West Virginia doomed our ability to do that, right? Which then led directly to the reliance on tax credits that was inadequate for the job, right? And in light of the fact that I think that we are no longer, a lot of the panel was trying to make the pitch that industrial strategy is a respectable thing to engage in. And unlike, say, 10 years ago, unlike when the prior questioner was talking about, the parties of the right are with us. Right? You don't have to make that pitch to, you do not have to make that pitch to Donald Trump's Republican Party. And I don't think you have to make it to Nigel Farage. It's a battle within the parties of the left, both in the country we are sitting in and in the United States. And the question that raises is, what is the political economy that will enable the kinds of ideas the panel has in front of it to succeed within the parties of the left against the opposition of both finance and tech? Right? That seems to me to be the core issue here of this panel and perhaps of this entire meeting.
Damon coming to play. All right. In the polka dots and then up here in the blue blazer.
Thank you for a great panel. I'm Jasmine Sierra. I'm an assistant professor in political science at Notre Dame. I think the panel made a really convincing idea that we are beyond neoliberalism in terms of policy ideas in industrial policy. But the question I have is, are we beyond neoliberalism in terms of the institutional capacity needed to implement industrial policy? And what are the implications of that? Because one of the key takeaways of kind of the developmental state literature is that you needed these institutions that coordinated, that had a meritocratic bureaucracy, that had close ties with entrepreneurs in order to carry out a successful industrial policy. And like was just said in the previous question, so far we have a lot of industrial policy through tax breaks, right? And so the question is, can we do industrial policy without that kind of institutional capacity? And I was wondering if Todd in particular might be able to discuss whether this was addressed at all in discussions within the Biden administration of building up that industrial capacity and what those discussions look like. Thank you.
Thanks. Right up here. And a quick two finger.
Thank you. Jonathan Bart from the Zoe Institute. I have one question for Todd, particularly looking at the IRA. So I think the understanding we still have of the IRA delivering is still a bit outdated in the sense that it's ultimately about the jobs created on the ground. And I'm wondering whether you have done any studies or you know of any studies to what extent this actually also translated into higher well-being on the ground. Because the discussions we have had here in Europe before the new commission coming in were about, it's ultimately not the jobs and incomes anymore that are mattering, but it's really what you can afford with that. Healthcare, access to education, access to public utilities and so forth, right? So is that discussion happening there, and how is the US side thinking about that? And the other one is a more comparative approach of the US and the EU. So I really like your point that you said Biden's industrial policy program was driven by decarbonization, anti-monopoly, and worker empowerment. The US approach is driven by decarbonization and competitiveness. We're totally missing the anti-monopoly angle, and we're totally missing the worker empowerment angle. On the contrary, Draghi's argument has been we need to go for scale, because scale is going to drive down prices. And we cannot link it too much with worker empowerment, because this would, put the companies in places where you maybe don't have the skills that they're actually, that they need to produce. So I'm curious to see how did that kind of approach play out in the US. So on the question of scale, to what extent has the RA benefited incumbents first and foremost, or has it actually also given rise to new companies? So is it really a competitive system we are seeing there, or how is that taken care of? The other one is then on the worker empowerment question, like how did the investments in low-income communities actually play out, and was there a problem with that they maybe didn't have the skills that have been required?
Thank you. Right next, and then we'll come back up here.
One finger, sorry, this time. I'm Jayati Ghosh. I teach at UMass Amherst, and that was fascinating. Thank you. This is really related to the questions that were already asked, but it's about what you said in the beginning, Noam, about disciplining capital. I mean, a lot of everything you've said about market shaping, etc., China was doing that and did it very successfully. But that's because they were able to discipline capital. And it seems to me both the US and EU haven't even got that on the agenda. So I'm just asking about that.
Okay, so we've got military Keynesianism, political economy, institutions, specifics on labor and anti-monopoly, and Shadi's intervention here. Let's give you each 90 seconds, 2 minutes, and take what you want. Gary, how long do we have? What are we running till on this panel?
We have 45 minutes.
Take
Really? Yeah.
Take 2.5 minutes.
So I'm going to address the political economy and institutional questions. I agree, and I'm pessimistic about the split on the left, actually. So to take an example from the current UK government, there's clearly a split within the government about the approach to the big American tech companies, with one group, Peter Coyle, a DCIT, advised by the Tony Blair Institute, clearly thinking that bring in the big tech companies, they'll build a few data centers, they will give us the growth that we want in AI. And another group who see this as an exercise of extending market power, making it impossible for UK AI companies to grow into the market and enter the market, and taking the value that's been created by content creators around in the creative sector. Problems as there are with the copyright law. And I'm actually rather pessimistic about the willingness of the government to go with growing smaller UK companies in these sectors. And I don't know what you do about that. A number of us have been making arguments against it for some time, and I just don't know what you do about it. So I'm rather pessimistic about that. And similarly about institutional capacity, picking up on Carsten's point about supply chains, we don't know enough about how these supply chains work, because all of the civil servants who used to be really close to industry got sacked, business departments been thinned out. Apparently they've grown in number since Brexit quite a lot, but I don't know what they're doing because they don't have that knowledge about how industries operate and how supply chains operate that they would have had in the 1990s and even into the 2000s. And so when you combine that with the philosophical tensions or disagreements within the government, that it's not clear that everybody's going to want it to happen, and even if they want it to happen, it's not clear that we can make it happen. So I'm a pessimist.
Fair enough. No.
I'll speak to the political economy question and maybe the scale question. So Jayati asking about how to discipline capital. So there's Vec Chibber has a piece about this that I really like, where he talks about, how do states gain that capacity? And there's a tendency to associate disciplining capital with authoritarian regimes or some kind of centralized state bureaucracy as more able to discipline capitalists, which there are some historical examples of that. But he says, actually, we shouldn't be too pessimistic because democracy is also often a very good way of disciplining capital. Basically, if you mobilize the grassroots, if you mobilize the working class, they make it possible for the state to gain some measure of autonomy vis-a-vis capital rather than get captured. And in a way, this is something that I was kind of pointing to in my comments, that in the 19th century also, these top-down efforts by the state to do it failed until there was some kind of social coalition between the grassroots and subparts of the business community together, being able to wield that kind of leverage. So I don't think we should be overly pessimistic, but I think people who've pointed out for this being one of the main challenges of how to get working class power and mobilization to assert itself and gain leverage vis-a-vis the state, which to get the state to discipline capital. I think that is kind of one of the core challenges that we're talking about. In terms of the question of scale, which is interesting, and also kind of thinking about it through my actors in the 19th century, what should we do? Should we allow companies to grow and kind of nurture national champions, or should we break up monopolies and cut them down to size? I think looking at it from the kind of the origins of antitrust, there is something, it's actually not a dilemma. These are just two ways of getting capital to invest productively in desirable things. And these are two ways that the state can wield leverage vis-a-vis these companies. So you either introduce competition into the marketplace, which is a kind of lever that the state can use, or you try to regulate those monopolies, which is another kind of challenge. But in both cases, whichever way you go, the goal is the same, which is how to move them into basically shape the types of investments and policies that these corporations try to pursue.
I would just add that in the U.S., there's a lot of debate about curbing share buybacks of recipient companies getting these tax dollars, at least over a certain threshold. Didn't happen in the Biden era legislation, but I think it's got bipartisan support. Todd?
Yeah, so a lot of, I think, interconnected questions here in this round. I think as Damon can attest, and others as well, Jen, that, probably the year between the summer of 2021 and the summer of 2022 is maybe the longest of our lives. That was basically between the idea of Build Back Better sort of being introduced into the House all the way towards what eventually became the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think if you look at the ideas that were left on the cutting room floor of that period, you're going to find a lot of interesting things that relate to labor, that relate to state capacity, to a lot of the questions that were raised here about political economy. For one, I would mention is the idea of a union bonus, a labor union bonus for electric vehicles that would have made more generous the subsidies that were actually made by unionized workers. While that's only one sector, it would have been conceptually one of the biggest shifts in labor law and labor relations in the U.S. that you could have built on had you been able to get that through. But unfortunately, due to an extensive lobbying effort by the European Union's Washington delegation on behalf of their own automakers that produce primarily in the anti-union South of the U.S., they were able to kill that. There was a lot of proposals around state capacity to double, triple the size of the Department of Commerce so that they could actually have eyes and ears on the supply chains in real time. This would be capacity that would exist not just over the next few years, but permanently. That was killed by the U.S. Senate when it took up the legislation. And then there was, of course, the whole part of Build Back Better that would have been very visible and made an immediate change in people's lives, which is the healthcare and childcare elements that would have seen people, voters by the next time they went to the ballot box would have benefited from that. That was killed by Joe Manchin, that Damon mentioned, the senator from West Virginia. So I think that all of this kind of shows that industrial policy is inextricable, hard to say, from democracy reform, right? These are sort of fundamental anti-majoritarian structures of U.S. life. There's, similar institutions in every country. We need to be addressing those if we're going to have a chance of really doing any kind of structural transformation. I think that I mentioned sort of the private investment, labor empowerment, anti-monopoly planks of the middle out economics. I think the private investment is going to be on hold for the next few years, outside of a few sectors like shipbuilding, AI, where there's some bipartisan consensus. But I think that it's very important that the labor and anti-monopoly sides keep going and keep getting built up in civil society, because that really is the way longer term and medium term around some of the blockages that we see in our political economy. And I think the question on sort of specific research, both of you asked on sort of labor standards versus well-being and kind of broader considerations. One of the Roosevelt Institute fellows, Bettany Jones, is doing a project for us on exactly these questions, comparing and contrasting different projects by sort of just how comprehensively they improved people's lives across a range of different policy tools, and what worked better and what worked less well. And Bettany was the person at the Department of Energy responsible for labor. So please stay tuned for her research on that question.
Great. Thanks very much. So I'm going to speak to the question on why can't we just operate industrial policy without constraint, similar we do to military spending and then the institutional capacity question. So basically, underlying this question is, if industrial policy is so great, why don't we just do much more of it? Right? The Labour government, more will come out in the spending review, but by one calculation, their spending on industrial policy is about 0.25% of GDP, 0.25% of GDP per year. So not very much. So while they're doing something and a lot of innovative stuff, it's actually not a lot of money. Some have called it Bidenomics without the money. Maybe it's more Bidenomics with not that much money. But so what's constraining that? It's basically, they could just, putting tax aside for a moment, but is financial markets, and is the fear, high borrowing costs, and is the fear that industrial policy won't have a growth dividend and will make the fiscal picture worse. And, to some extent that is sort of the financial regime that we're in and the paradigm, but there is also just a real lack of research on what will work and how large the returns will be. And so it is actually difficult for a government that is constrained by financial markets to make big bets on industrial policy because it's just uncertain whether this will pay off. And so I think there is an interesting piece maybe that a lot of economists, industrial organization researchers could do more to make the case of what will work and what the likely economic returns in terms of growth, but also in terms of well-being and so will be. And just quickly, just from the sort of some interactions with government of what are the state capacity challenges that are really urgent, because again, Labour is trying to do that. And I think some of the big questions here are, how, if you want to do industrial policy, how do you pick the industries you support if you have limited amounts? And they have quite a long list now, right? From financial services to advanced manufacturing to creative industries. So, but even within that, how do you pick? What do you do? It's not a straightforward question at all. And some of them are really costly, right? If you want to support steel, is that definitely worth it? What's your growth justification or your resilience justification? And Diane mentioned you need to really understand the supply chain. In addition to that, I would say, if you have, say, a health mission, if you want to do health industrial policy, and the government has a health mission, you also need to really break down what that means in terms of the different levers that need to be pulling. And it's quite sort of an interesting systemic social science question that government is just not very well equipped to do. And just to finish with, I think it's partly that the government needs to get up to speed, but the scientific community has a big role to play in saying, here's how you model this, here's how you pick sectors, here's how you break down a mission and deliver it. And I think there's definitely a big demand for that.
A plug for a group in the U.S. called Jobs to Move America, who has been working on IRA, a little bit of CHIPS, mostly IRA recipient companies, to negotiate project labor agreements up front, essentially like a plan for where you're going to get your workforce and how you're going to treat them. And their early findings are that you do see projects coming in under time and under budget. because you don't have to put shovels down and go round up a new set of construction workers midway through. I'm going to, Heather, and then we're going to come back broadly.
Thank you. Heather Boucher. I'm currently a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School with Danny at the Reimagining the Economy Project, which has been wonderful. Thank you, Danny. So what an amazing, amazing panel. Thank you all. Just really, I've learned a lot. I had two questions. I'm not going to make them comments. They're going to be two questions, but I'm going to riff off of what Carl said at the end, because I had been thinking about that and I kind of wanted to push Diane and others on. So if we're here about, kind of thinking about beyond neoliberalism and what is a paradigm change, you have to think about the kinds of questions that are reasonable to ask. And as an economist, I think at least in the United States, one of the biggest questions is both about state capacity, but also where the technicians are being trained. And I would argue that the two biggest parts of economics, my profession, that are most connected to industrial policy are the trade people and the IO people. And neither of them have been doing this work for a very long time. And yet those are the people that we kind of turn to, and there's some real challenges there. So I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that. Like, how do we think about the interplay between the state capacity and the academic capacity and build that out? And I, for one, was heartbroken about the money that didn't go to the Department of Commerce, because I think that could have created a pipeline of jobs for those kinds of people where they could see a career path. And that all seems to be breaking down in Washington at this point. But I would be very curious, if other countries are doing that better. Thoughts on that? Totally unrelated, but a second question, because a number of the questioners over here have asked about the tax credits maybe not being the best way to do it, to do industrial strategy. So here's the thing. One thing that hasn't come up, although it did come up just at the end in these remarks, was one of the good things about the tax credits is that you weren't picking winners and losers. You were saying, hey, we think this industry is important. Which firms, whatever you want to do, will give you the tax credit. That has the potential to create a lot of innovation and vitality, or so we thought. I think that there is some emerging evidence there, but I would be curious how you think we get the competitiveness and that can drive innovation as we get to commercialization without creating tools that do that. So how do we reconcile our desires to have good, industries that create good jobs with our desires to have industries that can be really competitive and drive each other towards best practices and innovation? And I think that is just a line that I'd like to push all of you on. But again, thank you. Great panel.
Great. Liz, I think it is. And then we'll come up here and go over there.
Thanks. Liz Pancotti from the Groundwork Collaborative. I was a Senate staffer during the days I affectionately call the Build Back Never days of that very, very long year, where there was at one point a $6 trillion spreadsheet and then it whittled down. So I'm familiar with all of the programs that ultimately didn't go into it. Switching gears, though, I think I would love to hear from the panel on how much and how actually should we think about affordability and cost as a part of post-neoliberal industrial policy. Diane, I'd be curious how this fits or doesn't fit into your quantitative modeling and evaluation. And Noam, I'd be curious of your take on the historical perspective on the importance of prices, thinking about rail robber barons and Roosevelt era price control policies. Todd, I know we have talked extensively about how Bidenomics fell short, or at least its public perception, because of its lack of attention or sense of urgency on prices, though I will remind people that if you look at the inflation graph, the month that the IRA was signed into law is the inflection point, so it did work a little bit. And Carsten, how are both consumer and producer prices factoring into UK discussions and EU writ large around industrial policy? I know you mentioned utilities, which is also a large issue in the United States that we have not yet cracked the nut on. But I think both in light of China's ability to artificially lower prices for both consumers, though largely not their own, and producers, or conversely, the approach of military Keynesianism, where price is basically not a concern. Price is a concern for normal consumers in any context, American, UK, or others. And so I would really challenge the panel to think through what are our post-neoliberal, beyond neoliberal policies and tools for reining in prices, especially on essentials for families and critical inputs, and what are the next wave of tools to do that, as opposed to just subsidizing the creation of those products.
Great. Let's come up here, Gary. Yourself.
Thank you, panelists, for a great panel. I first want to say, is Julius Krein here?
He is.
We would be remiss if we ended this panel without having him weigh in with his perspectives on industrial policy. So, Julius, this is not obligatory, but if you are here, I would like to hear from you
I'll add Danny to that.
on the industrial policy.
Highly voluntary, but encouraged.
And then I want to ask, mostly this panel's been focused, with the exception of Noam, has been focusing on what I would call the supply side of industrial policy, as opposed to the demand side of industrial policy. And by that I mean is how do we develop these policies? How do we get them out of the gate? How do we make them work? The demand side is where is the groundswell of support for these sorts of policies? And part of my observation about Bidenomics is that groundswell never really developed. And yet there is enormous anger at corporate privilege in America. I've been maybe misspending too much time thinking about Luigi Mangione and his assassination, cold-blooded assassination of the United Healthcare executive on the streets of New York one morning. The support for Mangione's actions among young people in America is extraordinary. 40% of young people condone his action. They don't see any problem with it. Doesn't mean they would take it upon themselves to do it, but they see it as a legitimate attack on corporate privilege and power and exploitation that has ruined and murdered a lot of people's lives. And I've watched a lot of misspent hours on TikTok videos trying to understand this world. But there doesn't seem to be any easy way of converting that anger into support for these sorts of industrial policies. And of course, these sorts of industrial policies, if we're serious about disciplining capital, are meant to address that anger. There has been in American history this kind of anger at corporate privilege and capitalism unrestrained. And that anger from below, and I think Noam was getting at part of this, made a huge difference. And this refers to Damon's point as well. It's not just a matter of involving labor, it's a matter of finding support among ordinary people to get them as excited about this project as they are about other projects. Think about all the populist fury there is in the world right now. How can some of this be channeled into this project? And I don't really have an answer to that question.
Right behind you, and then Bill.
Thank you so much. I'm Maurice, a PhD student at Oxford working on climate policy financing. You mentioned tax credits, but a key part of the IRA was also setting up the DOE's loan program, but also green banks to fund projects via blended finance with public and philanthropic funds that de-risk private investments in these sectors. So how do you kind of assess these parts of the IRA, and do you see any future, especially using philanthropic funds to supplement the public funding of these programs? And secondly, when Energy Secretary Granholm left office, she reflected on her time as the governor of Michigan and as an energy secretary, and she mentioned that even before, kind of during this neoliberal era, especially states were very much involved in a lot of industrial policies, thinking about the competitive federalism literature, but also Michigan and states like Georgia did a great job in attracting a lot of IRA funding by supplementing this with state-level policies. So how do you see the role of states going forward?
Thank you. Bill, we got another mic coming to you right now.
Yeah, one thing I haven't heard yet from the panel, may come out future days, is the tension, partly driven by economists, between efficiency and effectiveness in policy. So generally, we tend to look for state intervention where market processes have broken down, where there are externalities that require intervention. But then we criticize the intervention because it's not sufficiently efficient, which is what gets us into this problem in the first case, in trying to optimize in a radically uncertain world where people are interacting very complex ways. So I'd be interested in kind of the political economy escaping from what I call the efficiency trap.
Great. Ganesh and Julius. Ganesh, put your hand up and say something.
I can let Julius go first, but happy to say a few things. So to your initial question for me, which was about the utilities natural monopoly question, I think there's a broader set of criteria that we need to be thinking about, not just natural monopolies, but this whole category of firms and businesses and services in which competition is not likely to work very well. And that can be sectors in which you have natural monopolies in a kind of a narrow economic sense, or natural oligopolies, or just places where you have services that tend to be means to other ends, that are general purpose, that have tendencies to consolidation, that have network effects, where we want universal service. And in all of those things, which are infrastructures, networks, utility-like sectors, you may want to have either direct public provision and a public monopoly, and many countries have that for many of these sectors. Think about rail, postal systems, and so on, or a kind of privatized system that is regulated as a public utility to ensure that you don't have qualities of service that are declining and prices that are rising. And the system that the United States developed for that over a period of time was actually remarkably successful, as Noam has shown historically in his work, at both delivering on the goods that it was trying to provide, but also on encouraging growth and development in different geographies, a kind of place-based industrial policy via regulation of these infrastructure industries, and railroads are a great case study of that. So I think there's, to connect it to the broader conversation, there's a whole toolkit of regulatory policies that fit into the industrial policy category that I think are usually not part of the industrial policy conversation, but would be helpfully brought into the story. The last point, just to connect to Danny's comments, are, I think when we think about market failures as the way to get at the problem, you start with a baseline of the magic of the market. Rather than starting with the baseline of the social goods we are trying to achieve. And in some cases, if you try to achieve a certain set of social goods, say you want electrification of the entire rural population of the United States, the market may or may not deliver that. And lots of policies could be helpful for doing that. Cooperatives, public provisioning, regulation, subsidies, any number of things. But starting from that question of what are we trying to accomplish as a policy matter strikes me as, in many of these cases, a better way to think about the full toolkit of industrial policy options that might be available.
Thank you. Julius? He's here. I saw him earlier. Okay. Up here, black shirt, glasses, phone.
Hi, yeah, my name is Melanie Bressler. I'm curious, and this might sound like a comment, but it's a serious question. At the outset, Jen mentioned that industrial policy and also state incursion into the economy is increasingly a bipartisan affair. And I wonder, just with the provenance of this, or with the occasion of this conference as well, if some of these markers, such as state versus economy, free trade versus whatever is the opposite of free trade, are the right coordinates to be thinking about what is beyond neoliberalism and what the point of this sort of project is.
Right here. Yeah, right here.
Hi, my name is Bilal Hafiz. I work in finance. I had a question. A lot of the industrial policy that we've been talking about seems to be focused on manufacturers. So whether it's building chips in the US or data centers, it's very sort of narrowly focused, or in some ways trying to copy what China's doing. What do people think about services, industrial policy around services, especially in the context of healthcare provision in the aging population and that construct? And the other related thing within services is kind of a subset of how do you then think about the digital realm of data, software. So one issue that could come up is if everyone's building chips, we're probably going to get collapsing chip prices in the future. So there's no point backing chips, and instead it may be software in the future. So how does one think about kind of a more future-looking set of policies rather than kind of industrial manufacturers.
Gary, how much longer do we have? Your mic. Okay, great. Over here. Danny, totally voluntary, but highly encouraged. Any reflections you have?
Hi, my name is Richard Johnson. I'm a colleague of Noam's at Queen Mary, University of London. I wanted to, I think this word has only been used once in passing, and it was by Diane at about 85 minutes in, which is Brexit. And I wanted to ask about Brexit, because whatever you might think about Brexit and the motivations for it, one reading of it is it was a certain revolt against globalization, and particularly perhaps a cry against the effects of neoliberalization in parts of the country that hadn't benefited from Britain's inadvertent industrial strategy on finance or the creative industries or pharmaceuticals. And part of what Brexit entailed was a restoration of control from the perspective of the UK government over many of the tools of industrial strategy, which, while in the EU, may not have been impossible, but were often contingent on our treaty obligations and EU institutions. And so I wonder if the panel thinks that there is the missing ingredient from the perspective of the Labour government, and thinking about how, to bring in Gary's question about the kind of populist rise, to take ownership of some of those tools and to think about how to use those tools as a means of creating a new industrial strategy.
Just saw a quote from John Rawls predicting that the creation of the EU would someday culminate in something looking like Brexit. So for all the talk of it being post-liberal. Let's take one or two more and then we'll come back. Anybody? Last words? All right. Diane.
Gosh, there's a lot to pick up. So, as I said in my opening comments, I'm not sure that the policy classes, the administrators in the civil service, or many politicians have actually abandoned the neoliberal paradigm. I think it's still there. And so the industrial policy that is being implemented is a kind of technocratic exercise with a lot of internal tensions. And for normal people, why would you support something a bit abstract about growing the AI sector or missions when your life is just a bit crap? The prices have gone up, especially in services where markets are concentrated, in like banking and energy. You get into voicemail hell or online menu hell if you're trying to sort out something. You've got to scan your own groceries. Public services have crumbled. And, paradoxically, though, it's globalization that brought down prices for a lot of consumers. And both Brexit and the Trump experiment will put those prices up. So for me, that makes competition policy really important as a means, the means we have to tackle corporate power if politicians are not going to do it directly. And that's got two problems. One is that you don't get people marching in favour of tougher enforcement of competition policy either. That's very technocratic too. And we also have in the UK a government that's been deliberately weakening competition policy and put the head of Amazon UK in charge of the Competition and Markets Authority. It's just absurd. So I think there is still a real political challenge and a philosophical challenge before we can shape industrial policies into the kind of things that build the coalitions that Noam was talking about so eloquently. Just one final word on Heather's challenge about the academics and what we're doing. I think there's something even more fundamental, which is having the data to understand what's going on. I've just written a book, so if I can give it a quick plug, there's a lot in there about what we're not measuring. We're not measuring a lot about supply chains, about prices. The statistical agencies in many countries have been underfunded at a time when corporations are putting fortunes into investing in data. And then, of course, in the US, Elon Musk has probably destroyed the federal statistical system. And so it's really hard to implement good policies and to know what's going on in people's lives and to do any economic research on it if the raw data isn't there to do it.
lots to comment on. I mean, I guess I'm feeling that the panel is a little bit Euro-American centric, and I think maybe we need to bring that into perspective. And in terms of, if you think broadly about industrial policy, a lot of the things we're talking about are really not unique to our situation now. It's really textbook. I mean, when you talk about the batteries, how do you manufacture the batteries, but then create demand for the batteries and the infrastructure that make the batteries useful? It's straight out of Hirschman. It's straight out of the textbook kind of challenges. But it used to be really kind of focused on those challenges in the global South, and now we're kind of awake. We're kind of waking up to these challenges in our own context and kind of losing some of our confidence. But really, these are the things that are really staples of any society that's trying to drive this type of change, both in recent decades, but really historically. So I wanted to just remind us of that this is just what it is. It's never easy, and it's never this kind of smooth set of policies that you put in place and it kind of explodes and takes off. It always involves this kind of messy technocratic debates and messy political challenges as well. It's a little dangerous to ask me to comment on prices because that's kind of what my obsession has been over the last couple of years, talking about primarily the case of railroads and how Americans regulated the rates. What I would say in terms of prices, like two things to maybe keep in mind, and I'm not entirely, we can think about how this can inform our own conversations. And this is something that I find very interesting, especially when I look at how the people I'm looking at are not educated technocrats or people who went to university to study political economy. These are people who are farmers who are just thinking about how to make sense of their own economic situation, and they think in very sophisticated ways. So when they think about prices, two things that I would emphasize. One, they always think about the structure of prices. So it's not just more or less expensive, but it's a kind of structure of what, once we make something more expensive, maybe we can make something else less expensive. What are the relationships between different types of prices within the system? In the case of railroads, it's a relationship between different types of long haul, short haul, different types of so they're really thinking about prices in this really complex relational way, which I think is a good way of thinking about prices rather than just kind of throwing everything into a kind of one metric. The other thing is that then once you begin to think about prices in this way, then you begin to think about prices really as a tool of planning. It's precisely what Hayek did not want people to do, but you begin to say, oh, this is actually a lever. This is a way that we can plan the economy in a more or less in a more indirect way, but nevertheless, this is a way for us to prioritize some activities over others. And maybe one last thing, maybe I'm kind of picking up on what Bill was saying, the kind of this efficiency question. You know what? Never. Maybe I'll pick that up later.
Very efficient.
Very efficient. So working at the Roosevelt Institute, I'm contractually required to mention FDR at least once in every speech. So I will do so now. I think if we sort of think in terms of the New Deal order that Gary's written a lot about, there's several components to it that I think get at sort of some of the questions that Liz was raising, and that others have been raising about how to build sort of a supply, the demand side for industrial policy. And I think it was, accepting that voters weren't dumb, that you could explain, if you treated them respectfully and explained patiently, like you could actually sort of share some pretty complex ideas. And I think that, coming into office, it was clear that for some industries and commodities, the price was too high. If for some other commodities and industries, the price was too low, and you needed to sort of restore profitability to some of these sectors. And so that's basically anti-monopoly and industrial policy going together. Now, the folks in the administration, in the FDR administration, that were tasked with sort of those different responsibilities. You had the neo-Brandisians, you had the industrial policy people, or the, I guess, original Brandisians and the industrial policy people. They were often at each other's throats, but it was a productive tension between these, so that you were sort of making sure that ultimately you were addressing sort of livelihood concerns, but also cost concerns that were animating folks. And you also had with that planning, right? In fact, a lot of the Republicans that the administration brought in under FDR were involved in sort of the planning apparatus. So that that there is a history there to look back at. But sort of all of that can be kind of technocratic. I think ultimately what's useful is to develop a politics around it, and developing, especially naming enemies. And being willing to go after them, pointing fingers directly at who's responsible for high prices, low prices. And I think that is something that a lot of politicians on the center left, to get back to Damon's question, are afraid to do. Including this last administration that I think was very positive sum oriented, would never talk about sort of raising taxes on billionaires before saying he had nothing against billionaires. I think it's okay to say you have something against billionaires. That's a lot of money. You shouldn't have that much money. It gives you too much power, right? So I think being willing to sort of name names, and I think that what we've seen, in recent years is that a lot of the policy chops are coming from the Democratic Party, but the willingness to name enemies, I think we're seeing more from the Republican side. I think it's been interesting over the last few weeks to have Trump sort of saying that he's telling Walmart not to pass on the tariff price increases. And you've had voices on the center left standing up for the honor of Walmart's 3% profit margin. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, that's a ridiculous politics. It's a dead-end politics. Similarly, when Trump was going after Carrier for offshoring jobs, I think that you can use the bully pulpit to name and shame. But then you got to back it up with policy, right? So I think you need both sides, and I think we're still learning how to take this, all of the sort of academic learnings that we've been talking about in this panel around industrial policy, and put it into a contemporary context that's a lot of hand-to-hand combat in the communication sphere. So you got to figure that out.
Carsten, last word.
Great, thank you. So just quickly on the industrial organization and analysis side, and one on the cost of living. So on, how do we actually do this analysis? Completely agree with Diane. We have very bad publicly available data, but that said, there's some organizations, again, like the International Energy Agency, who just invest a lot of money, partly create their own data, but like a lot of industry intelligence, market intelligence, and they do really understand stuff. So it shows it can be done if governments invest in it. And perhaps we want international organizations that invest in this type of capacity for new challenges, maybe like AI or something. So I think it can be done. In terms of analysis, so IPPR, we did a paper called Manufacturing Matters, which actually does make the case for boosting UK manufacturing. And then we do this approach where we say, what are the existing strengths of UK manufacturing? What are sort of potential strengths where you can build on existing industrial bases, which still is significant in the UK? How could that evolve in order to meet future needs? So the third bit is like, what are future markets going to be like? And this is using existing publicly available data to narrow down what kind of industry should you do industrial policy in. And I think some of this, the government took inspiration from some of that. And I think it would be really cool if people took that kind of approach and did it for other sectors, including doing it for service sectors, the social care sector, for example, and look at where exactly do we have comparative advantages, where should support go. And again, the UK government has financial services, professional services, so service sectors in their industrial strategy. So this will be a live discussion. And I think interesting if there's more analysis coming out. So just quickly to finish on the cost of living question, I love a survey from the US, which compared how important is one of these two issues for you, and it's cost of living and inflation versus another issue. Just to pick some out, like 94% of voters said cost of living more important than student debt. 85% said cost of living more important than inequality. 84% said it's more important than the environment. More than 2/3 say it's more important than immigration. So clearly this, this is not news to anyone here, but like it's just the dominant issue for voters on the economy. And in the UK, 40% of voters say Labour is doing worse, the current government is doing worse on tackling cost of living than the previous government, even though inflation is down. So it does feel like a really urgent policy area where, again, maybe as a community, we need to think about, can there be an industrial policy for cost of living, right? So finishing where I started at the beginning, can we have high-level goals for saying we're going to bring down housing costs, food, energy costs, and then work out the systemic policies that are needed to bring it down? Because it seems progressive governments, if they don't tackle this through really wide-ranging policies, they won't get re-elected. So if you have any ideas, be in touch. We're very interested in working together on that. Thank you.
Join me in thanking this wonderful panel.